Under the Mill is a production of SEH Studios Art and Susan E. Hanna. All rights are reserved. Hello, I'm Susan E. Hanna, fine artist. Join me as I create my oil painting, Under the Mill, on a 24 by 24 inch gallery wrapped canvas. This video shows me using oils to paint a complex scene of downtown Dover, New Hampshire. I'm going to demonstrate from beginning to finish with videos and still photos. I took this inspiration photo while kayaking on the Cocheco River in Dover, New Hampshire. There was a drought during the summer of 2020, and it allowed me to paddle under the Cocheco Mill building right up to where the water should have been pouring over the dam. The relatively still river flow combined with beautifully lit arches inspired me to create my own version of this scene on canvas. This painting includes the complicated perspective of my off-center view of the brick arches, as well as fantastic multicolored reflections in the water. Now, I almost never sketch my paintings in advance. I prefer to simply move the oil paint around until I'm happy with the architecture of the composition. However, I knew that this particular scene would require a more disciplined approach. So I decided to pencil sketch a 9-square grid onto the canvas after I overlaid the same grid onto the inspiration photo. Then I sketched the arches and main elements onto the canvas. I use a large television in my studio to display the photos I work from. I find it helpful to be able to zoom in or to reduce an image to the actual size I'm painting. Since I do a lot of painting outdoors, I like to imagine I'm viewing the image as I saw it there. You may wonder, why did she choose that spot to begin the painting? The answer is simple. I always begin with the part that is the furthest away. Here, the little bit of brick building I could see through the tunnel on the street above the dam is the furthest bit of this scene. Here's a little hyperlapse video showing how I began to paint this scene. The view through the arches is so interesting because it could be a painting all by itself. Instead, I've made it a painting within a painting. I work from top to bottom, and this is just a first pass. This is how the painting looks after the first session. The grayish color on the canvas is the graphite from the penciled grids that I've smeared with my hands as I've worked. The image is a little pixelated, so those odd striations you see going up and down are just a photograph of the canvas. Here, I continue to fill in the scene under the arches. I'm also refining details I painted during the previous session. You may notice that I've moved the angle of the canvas as I've painted. That's simply because I couldn't move my body to get the correct access angle while remaining within the camera frame for you folks. So I just moved the canvas a little. You can see here that I have filled the arches above the waterline and begun to get some color on the arch that is the farthest away from me. Here I have filled in the back arch, side columns, and roughed in the kayaker. In later sessions, I decided to move the location of that kayaker. You can see the beginning of the reflections also taking shape. I moved to the top of the painting so that the middle portion could dry a little before I worked there again. I began to fill in the arches, working from top to bottom. After a few days to let the paint set, I decided to tackle the kayaker again. But first, I added more details to the rocks of the dry dam behind him. Then I started from scratch again to paint the boat and paddler. You may notice that I spent a lot of time looking back and forth from the reference image to my painting. If you watch closely, you may also see that I rubbed the kayaker out several times before I get it the way I wanted it. That darn kayak. Here's the final product from that darn kayak session. I got a lot done in this long painting session. The arches were really wet, so I continued to work below them. The pink color under the arches, where I began the painting, is a building seen through the dam and across the street. I added windows and details. The rocks of the dam are too blue after the first session, so I grayed out that color. Then I skipped back down to the kayaker and added details to his clothing. I roughed in his reflection. Progress continued with color on the arches, arch supports, and foundations. As needed, I turned the canvas to continue the painting around the edges. The canvas wraps completely around all the edges. It's called a gallery wrapped canvas. Then I continued down into the water sections. All that yellow and green you will see in the water is the reflection of unseen trees growing across the street by that building. Here's a better view of how the painting looks as it continues around the edges. This photo shows the building and foliage that I am painting in the water's reflections. It helps to see where all the color is coming from, doesn't it? During this session, I worked hard on the reflections in the water. They are complex because in them I see the dark ceilings, the bright sun on the arches, and shadows and colors on the piers. One of the things that drew me to paint this scene was the way I could see the building and foliage in the distance, beyond the arches, reflecting in the water right in front of me. Did you notice the people walking around while I was painting? My space in Dover, New Hampshire is a working studio gallery that is open to the public. I often have visitors browsing while I'm working. After this little still shot, I continued to work on the background, which is the painting within a painting. Remember that photo I showed you of the mill buildings and foliage? Here I've pumped up the foliage, worked a little bit on the details of the mill. Then I'm moving back on down to the retaining wall of the dam and the rocks where the water should be cascading from. Continuing on down, I add blue into the reflections on the water and details on the kayaker's reflection in the water. Continuing on over, I'm adding details to the arches and their reflections. I've always found it easier to paint reflections as I'm actually painting the object that is being reflected. That way you tend not to miss something. Those dark areas of the reflections are the dark areas of the ceiling between the arches. I continue around the side and added details to the rockwork between the arches and supports. It took me several sessions to get all the color into the reflections, of course. And then up and around the arches, adding shadows continuing to work the reflections. I like to get the entire canvas covered with paint as soon as possible. Here I began to work the entire painting, moving around to tweak and refine details as well as add elements. You can see my vision come to life. In this session, I refined the closest arch to suggest brickwork. I absolutely did not paint every line in brick. I found that the human brain will allow us to see bricks and similar things with sufficient encouragement. I used a square-edged brush to mimic the contours of the bricks. The perspective around the piers and foundations of the arches was making me a little crazy, so I corrected the angles. And here's the photo showing the corrected waterline along the foundations. Here I used my brush to measure the length and width of the paddle against my inspiration photo. Then I used my own best judgment to block in the angle and length of it. I continued by filling out the paddle, making sure to paint in the colors of the watery reflections I saw on the broad tip. Then I added color and details to the paddler and the kayak. I've darkened the rocks behind the paddler so that he doesn't get lost in the glare of the sun on those distant rocks. There is a swirl in the water where the paddle came out of it, so I painted it. And there are ripples in the water where the kayak has traveled. I finished painting the arches to look like brickwork. You may note that I changed to smaller brushes as I moved to the back arches. And here's the result from that painting session. The kayak received more highlights and shadows. I sharpened the reflections on the paddle and added the hand cord on the back. I also refined the colors in the reflections in the water. I added more windows and fine-tuned the colors being reflected by the archwork. Working with the grain of the canvas, I added subtle shading to the arches by using a small amount of paint on a flat brush and gently stroking and rubbing across the fibers to darken some, but not all of them. Another progress shot after shading the arches and refining the reflections in the water. Just like the rest of the edges, I also paint the bottom of gallery wrapped art. You can see here how I match the colors to continue the image along the bottom edge. And here's the last step. Are you ready to see the final product? And here it is, under the mill, a 24-inch by 24-inch oil on gallery wrapped canvas. When it's completely dry, I will varnish it with a spray varnish. I like to use a gloss varnish because I think it restores the paint to the colors that it was when it was still wet. Also, I like shiny things. But last and not least, it will also protect your painting from fading and possible damage. This is Susan E. Hanna. Thanks for following along with me. If you found this interesting, please like, subscribe for updates, and share with friends. To learn more about materials, techniques, and my inspiration, check out additional instructional videos on all my social media outlets. I plan to build my video library with more demos, creation videos, and short clips about technique. Please see my website to shop my collection of available art and opportunities to learn. See you next time.